Welcome back. I hope you found the luncheon filling, but not too filling. We will do our best to be both interesting and entertaining for the next hour and 15 minutes to help you. And if that's not enough, hopefully they have plenty of coffee outside. For those of you who have joined since this morning, and for those of you who are here, I'm still Beryl Leach, and I'm still Director for Policy Advocacy and Communication at 3IE. And I have the pleasure of chairing this session this afternoon that's looking at what we're doing now in making increased investments in women's economic empowerment programming, but also what this means for evaluation and synthesis. And the question for this session is really, are evaluation and synthesis up to the task of the demands on us all to make sure that we are generating and using the best available evidence on what works, for whom, why, and how in improving women's economic empowerment. So what I would like to do is, this may look like a traditional panel, but it's not going to run like a traditional panel. That each one of the speakers, I'll introduce everyone, and then each speaker is going to give a short 5-minute or so overview of what it is they've been focusing on and what they think are their priority issues for us to discuss. And when we're finished with that, then we're going to have more of a conversation and ask each other questions and discuss what has been put out there. And as we can go along and time allows, bring in questions and comments from the audience. Okay? So without further ado, I'm going to go down the line and introduce everyone so that housekeeping is done. First up, who's Farzana Afridi, who's busily getting ready for what she's going to say, and it all looks very good. Farzana is an associate professor in the Economics and Planning Unit of the Indian Statistical Institute in Delhi. She is currently leading multiple projects that assess women's labor force participation under the Gates-supported, Yamini, is it what? How do you say it? Iwagi? What is it? iWage? The iWage initiative, which she is going to explain in a few minutes. Her research focuses on labor and development economics with a special interest in gender, human capital, and governance in India. To her left is Gillian Dowie, who's a senior program officer for Canada's International Development Research Centre Employment and Growth Team based here in New Delhi. She manages a portfolio of research on social and economic development interventions with a focus on women's economic empowerment across South and Southeast Asia. Then we have Bidisha Barooah, who's a senior evaluation specialist at 3IE, where she leads our well-established evidence programs on rural livelihoods in India and our new program on women's economic empowerment funded by the Gates Foundation. She's engaged in impact evaluations of women's livelihood programs in India and Bangladesh. She has authored a scoping paper and evidence gap map on agricultural risk and a map on group-based livelihoods. Then we have Yamini Atmavilas, who's been with the Gates Foundation for nearly 6 years and is based in New Delhi. As part of the gender equality team since 2017, she's been responsible for executing and evaluating the Foundation's women's economic empowerment strategy with women's collectives and evidence to policy work in India. Yamini's professional experience spans research and capacity building for government on gender budgeting, gender policy and program design, strengthening statistical systems for gender data, and has carried out operational impact evaluations on multiple government programs. And last but not least, and not our token male, is Thomas Dowie, a former colleague at 3IE who's moved on to the American Institutes for Research, where he's a principal economist in Washington, D.C. He has more than 12 years of experience in designing, implementing, and leading mixed method impact evaluations and systematic reviews focused in low and middle income countries. Currently, he oversees a research and evaluation portfolio with a focus on women's groups and education innovations. He is a co-principal investigator for a 4-year research project supported by the Gates Foundation that focuses on synthesizing, strengthening, and disseminating research on the impact, scalability, and cost-effectiveness of women's collectives in India, Nigeria, and Uganda. So, in the interest of time, I'm handing it over to you, Farzana.
So thank you so much for the invitation to 3IE and for the introduction. So I'm going to start with what was mentioned about what is IW wage. And Yamini, of course, here can speak much better to that. But since she's pushed me ahead, I'm going to elaborate on what IW wage stands for. So this is the initiative for what works for women and girls in the economy. So as you can make out from this acronym, essentially the focus of this initiative is to think in terms of the economic empowerment of women. So we can think of empowerment of women in very many different contexts. And one of the main contexts, the main focus of this initiative is the financial and the economic aspect. And since I'm an economist, and typically economists think that money drives the world, besides, of course, the economy. And then everything in terms of the social fabric and our lives are determined by money, right? So what I think is important from the point of view of this initiative in terms of focusing on economic empowerment is essentially to think about how economic empowerment can affect and influence empowerment in other contexts that's important for women. So for example, when we think of how empowered you are in terms of control over your own fertility, how empowered you might be in terms of decision making within the household, in terms of allocation of resources to education or health, how the budget within the household is determined, how it's distributed. So typically, as an economist, from an economist's perspective, we think that economic empowerment is the precursor essentially to empowerment in all other domains. And that would be true not just for women, but also all of us in general. So traditionally, when we thought of an empowerment, it's always been, as I said, in terms of earnings, in terms of income, and how that gives more voice to individuals, and in our context, women. So for example, one of the determinants of your earnings or your income is going to be the education that you have. And because that determines your labor market returns. And one of the things that we're looking at in this particular project, for example, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, is also some of these anomalies that get thrown up when you look at the data, because you have certain expectations in terms of, as individuals' education improves, you would think that they would become more empowered, or they would take certain decisions which would seem obvious to us, but they don't really happen, and I'm going to talk about it later. But what we are doing in this project more broadly is also to think about how economic empowerment then interacts with the social fabric. So it's not something that is in vacuum. For example, how do household dynamics speak to economic empowerment, and how might they determine economic empowerment of women? So for example, what we're thinking of is, traditional roles within the household in terms of allocation of time. How do the dynamics between the husband and the wife determine how much time the woman is going to spend at home, as opposed to how much time the husband is going to spend on domestic work, on childcare, which in turn is then going to determine how much time the woman is allocating to the labor market, which will determine then whether she has enough earning capacity and therefore is economically empowered or not. So in that sense, the household dynamics are going to have an influence on these economic outcomes for individual members within the household. But then these also, when we think in terms of communities and in terms of networks, what we tend to forget usually also is that there are certain expectations and certain norms around what kinds of activities or what is expected work that women should be doing. So for example, there might be stigma attached around women doing factory jobs. So we have the Claudia Golden hypothesis, which talked about the evolution of these norms as economies evolve, as there are structural changes in societies and in the economy, where there might be stigma attached to certain kinds of work, and as women get more educated and you have those kinds of jobs available, particularly in the services sector, which are less looked down upon, you have more women going out and working, right? So we are working in a context where we want to understand how is it that household interactions across these different members. In addition to that, how do expectations of communities and social networks around these households influence the thinking of members of the household in terms of what they would want in the sense of how they would want to behave, or the control that men have over women's movements in and out of the household in terms of giving them access to economic resources. So I'm going to give you an example over here. In terms of what is it that we are looking at. So for example, when I was talking about education, so what we wanted to look at, for instance, is this very interesting phenomenon that we see in India, which is a non-linear relationship between education and women's labor force participation. So typically what you see in developed countries, for example, the OECD, is that as education increases, you have an increase in labor force participation. So it's a linear relationship. But in India, you see a decline in women's labor force participation as they get more educated, and then it rises slightly only at very high levels of education. So that's kind of startling, because you would expect that shouldn't be happening as women get more educated. You would expect, when using our typical definitions of empowerment, they should be going out there and working more. But what we are forgetting when we're thinking of that as an obvious relationship is that there are returns to working and investing your time at home, in children and in housework, and there are returns to the market. So is it possible that women, as a matter of fact, are sort of internalizing these expectations the society has, and think of these returns then that they're getting from the home, because as they're getting more educated, they're also getting more productive within the household. And the returns that they're getting from within the home is not just the non-pecuniary returns, but also the potential pecuniary returns in terms of the human capital investments they're making in the children versus the returns they would get from wages in the market. And what we see is that that's what's happening, that the returns at home are actually greater than the returns that they're getting in the market, because of which you see less participation in the market than you would expect under normal circumstances, or you would expect in the Western economy. So I'm just going to throw it out there for you to chew on, and then we can go on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That is a lot to chew on. Gillian.
Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit more information about the GROW program that was led by the IDRC, and I'm going to reflect a little bit on what that program was and what we as an organization learned from implementing it, which hopefully can carry over into a conversation about what everybody can learn from similar programs. So I'm actually going to focus a bit more on systematic reviews that impact evaluations. Okay, so from about 2013 to 2018, the IDRC, with our partners at DFID and the Hewlett Foundation, implemented the GROW program, which is Growth and Economic Opportunities for Women. What this was a research program that focused on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia primarily, but we tried to capture some global lessons as well through some macroeconomic research, just to make sure that we had that perspective. GROW ended up supporting 14 projects, and within that about 28 sort of sub-studies that produced just a huge number of outputs, I don't know, briefs, papers, documentaries, etc. And it was all sort of structured from the get-go around three common themes, which were economic growth and gender equality, or the kind of links between them at the macro level, the care economy, and barriers, sort of more direct barriers to women's labor force participation. 8 projects within GROW were impact evaluations, and lessons from that were really exciting, and I'm happy to share them, and maybe we can get more into the kind of lessons and the challenges from those in the discussion. But I'm going to go back to the 3 themes for now. So we had always intended to synthesize evidence under these 3 themes, but eventually in the end, and we did, and they're online and I can share them, But in the end, we added an additional 2, which felt really critical at the time. One was measurement of women's economic empowerment, and the other was social norms. So there were a couple of reasons for that. The first is that norms, like the concept of social norms, was not explicitly included in the calls for proposals that went out. So they were not explicitly a focus in any of the projects. But at the end of sort of 4 or 5 years of research, almost every project produced evidence on social norms, and it was often as some sort of unexplained variable. So I think it merits a lot more direct focus. The result is that synthesis is less oriented towards evidence of what works to shift norms, but more about documenting what they are, because that was not intentional in the project. If we launched another call for proposals now, that would be intentional. And the other piece was measurement, which I think was extremely important. And it was because when we started the GROW program, we started with a definition of women's economic empowerment. It was in the proposals, it was in all of our background papers, et cetera. And we thought that was a pretty common definition. And then when we started getting research outputs from these 28 sub-projects, we could see this huge diversity of the way people were approaching and understanding women's economic empowerment, because these were often single country or 2-3 country studies that were really grounded in local context, being driven in a lot of cases by local organizations. So that synthesis in particular ended up coming up with about 40 different definitions that were used of women's economic empowerment, and so, just a huge diversity in the indicators that were also used to measure that. And the authors who were at McGill University, what they recommended at the end was not that we should all try to have some common definition and we should all work towards that, but actually that the definition should in fact be context specific, that 40 definitions was probably about right. And I'm sure that there's many, many more. And these definitions should be designed in consultation with the women in the communities in any given context, which is, I guess, what mostly happened in GROW, which is a good sign. This can make synthesizing the evidence later a little bit more difficult, but at the end of the day, I think it produces the most accurate sort of context-specific evidence. The other important thing that the synthesis exercise did across all of the 5 syntheses that we ended up putting together was to bring together the diverse studies that use different methodologies. So like I said, we had 8 impact evaluations, but there was also a lot of macro studies, we had some qualitative research, just like a lot of different methodologies that were used to talk about different challenges and different approaches to overcome those. So the syntheses gave us a picture of the challenges that were across contexts, some elements of the solutions that worked across contexts, or examples of solutions that worked just in one place and maybe less well in another place, that are testable in another environment, all kind of in pursuit of a common goal. But bringing the knowledge together from these different types of research and the different levels of analysis, micro, macro, meso, was I think a huge contribution to the program. And now within IDRC, our learning is that we are going to try shifting in our next strategic cycle all of our programming towards synthesizable evidence and try to be more focused, because it works when we have a program like GROW, which is an umbrella program that has research questions from the beginning, that has partners involved. But in our regular programming, it's a bit less focused, and we don't produce evidence that all kind of answers the same question in our different teams. And so we're trying to shift towards that and identify and just try to be more focused on what we want to produce, and so that we have these big bodies of evidence that really can create an impact and be useful for outside audiences in a more obvious way than a lot of different projects that don't connect super well. So that's something that we kind of learned and we're going to focus on a lot more moving forward. And I also think that kind of cohort level approach where you're bringing together, even if you're still funding a series of individual projects, they all lead towards something. You create a network of those researchers who can then work together, they share knowledge more easily, they find ways to collaborate more easily, and I think that that's also a really important kind of outcome of these types of programs.
Great, thank you very much. Bidisha?
Thanks. So Farzana and Gillian have already spoken a bit about social norms and networks, and my hope is to just elaborate a bit more on that, drawing primarily from 3I's experience on intervention, on studying programs that are aimed at women. 3i, as in 3i, we have been involved not only as a funder of some path-breaking work in the space of women's economic empowerment. We are doing a multi-state impact evaluation of the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, which is a livelihoods program, as the name suggests, for women through self-help groups. We have also, in the past, worked on formative evaluations of a very, very interesting project, and which was taken up to scale. Project Mesha is what we called it. It was also funded by the Gates Foundation. It was taken up in a very big way by the government of Bihar, which was about giving transfers of goats, small ruminants, to women and empowering them along the value chain. We are currently working on another similar value chain related intervention and evaluation of this in related to aquaculture in Bangladesh. And we are about to launch our a big thematic window evidence program on women's economic empowerment, focusing primarily on collective enterprises and true linkages. And so in that background, I just want to talk a bit about what we have learned and how we are taking it forward to our upcoming evidence program. Well, we know that there are some pretty well-known and popular tools for measuring women's economic empowerment in agriculture. Perhaps the most popular and very, very widely used across context is the WEIA. It has been adapted into fisheries. It's called WEIA-F or something like that. But when it comes to entrepreneurs, so these are as opposed to smallholder women farmer, who exactly are women small entrepreneurs? These are typically women who have some amount of capital, who would like to be involved in production activities and sell it to the market. And here, our experience has shown that there are certain gaps in understanding empowerment of these women. In a farm sector, empowerment, when you understand what a woman farmer is focusing on, empowerment has focused on her personal empowerment, her decision making and her bargaining powers vis-a-vis her household, vis-a-vis her husband and other family members, and whether she has access to productive home-based resources or not. When you're looking at a non-farm entrepreneur, a woman who is producing something for the market, the domain in which the woman interacts is much larger. So she's not, there are many more actors that she's participating, she's interacting with. And there's really not much is known is what is her empowerment vis-a-vis these other actors who may be from her community, may not be from her community, or maybe is she going to choose someone who is within her community. Couple of formative work that 3i has undertaken on its own, based for the women's, for our Swashakt empowerment evidence program, for our aquaculture work, and with relation to Project Mesha, has thrown some light on these factors. First, we find, for example, let us take the example of women fish farmers in Bangladesh. The idea of the intervention is to get them into the value chain, not just be restricted to consumption of fish within the household, but to sell it in the markets. In our pilot, we found that women farmers, first, there are very few female fish farmers because of the social barriers that Farzana has spoken about. But not only that, her social network, economic networks are also inefficient. Very few women have actually interacted with a fish buyer on a day-to-day basis or even on a monthly basis. They barely know what the market looks like, and you're trying to push. So to push them into the market, that kind of social network, entrepreneurship networks need to be developed, which actually brings me directly to the question that Farzana has posed. what comes first? Is it the social empowerment leading to economic empowerment leading to further social? I think it's probably a loop. The contrasting case is the case of Project Mesha, which is of goat owners, women goat owners in Bihar. Here we saw something very different. The 3IE study found that women goat farmers actually have a lot of decision-making capacity when it comes to small ruminants. This is very different. They don't have any control over larger ruminants, the larger big valued animals. There are also very informal value chains that are well established, which collect the goat from the woman farmer, take it to the market. But what is the flip side of it all? The women don't get the value that is required, that they should be getting for their goats. So essentially, women entrepreneurs are faced with less efficient networks, longer supply chain. There are also several women have reported opportunity costs. So their self-perceived opportunity cost of participating in the market is very high. What will happen if I go out in the market? My children will be ruined. They'll do very bad. The cost to my household would be much higher. These are effectively things that have not been measured well, and I'm really hoping that in our upcoming evidence program we will be able to understand these better. So in a nutshell, just want to conclude that empowerment of women with relation to other actors, take it stepwise, household, community, beyond that, that's something that requires understanding. And we are trying to understand this, 3IE is trying to understand this in our aquaculture program and in our Swasthak evidence program. So we're not going only to look at women's access to resources, but we also want to understand their access to social networks and entrepreneurial networks.
Thanks, Bidisha. Yamini, please.
So the Gates Foundation is likely one of the last entrants into the gender equality world. Listening to Gillian just tells me how much, how much work has gone before, several decades of work by many other funders. So, and I think we've had the advantage of being late entrants to sort of see, take a time to understand where we can really add value, fill gaps, as well as where we can partner with those who are already in this space and amplify our work together. So I'll come back to the problem of defining women's economic empowerment in a minute, but I'll just lay out what are some of the areas that we are working on. For the foundation, both evidence generation as well as supporting implementation are both priorities. So our grants that we've been making over the last year or so have included both. And I would say evidence is sort of a lever for us, that generating evidence is also a form of implementation, because you're trying to create knowledge, evidence can become an intervention in trying to shift attitude, shift investment, shift policymakers to think differently about issues, and of course to shift ourselves and our own organizations. So I would say maybe this is very much work in progress, as always with us, but I think there are 5 areas that we've identified as areas that we seek to drive positive change in. The first is on women and girls' voice and agency. And so building both individual as well as collective agency through groups and collectivization, building women's representation is one of our first areas. A second is on social norms and gender norms, understanding the effects of both restrictive and adverse gender norms on things like mobility, decision making, the kinds of things that the previous speakers have alluded to, are very much part of both a research as well as testing agenda for us. And certainly gets bundled in with anything that we want to work on gender. So I think it's not a norm, doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's very much a part of anything that we want to actually understand as well as shift. A third area for us is labor force participation. I think we cannot avoid working on this, given the kinds of complexities that Farzana has talked about, and our whole initiative on what works to advance women and girls in the economy is focused very much around understanding both barriers as well as where there are second generation questions of testing solutions, trying to see how do you design those solutions so that women can access them. So unpaid work is a nice example where, again, we don't have to prove that women do unpaid work. I think there's ways we can derive it. We've got, 20 years ago, there was a time use survey done, and there's another time use survey happening with the government. So I think we don't need to prove or try, of course you may learn something in terms of estimations and so on, but for us that's very much in a solution testing space, whereas another one like mobility maybe where we want to understand how do women actually what do those transport economies look like for women, how do you build safe and affordable transportation, how do you make that universal, how do you make it accessible to all women. So I think there's different questions around different generational questions around different barriers. A third area for us is around enterprises, and they're specifically sort of thinking about collective enterprises, and the solidarity economy is the term that the ILO uses. So really thinking through both in terms of understanding that women need institutions, women need communities and their collectives, and so, but at the same time, you don't want that social capital to be, to sort of be just something in the private domain, but that, how do you actually ensure that there is risk sharing and there is sort of a more collective bargaining approach that one could take, and how do you strengthen that with groups? And so within that, I think we recognize there's both data gaps as well as just, evidence of how do you make these happen, and how do you make these happen in ways that both preserve the empowerment as well as the viability goals of any economic enterprise, per se. And a final area is, of course, access to markets and access to finance, which are very, very critical, and are, within the foundation, there's been a long history of working on agriculture, working on financial inclusion, and certainly our We work dovetails into that and sort of takes that into the next step. So as I said, within this, I think being focused on both generating evidence of what works, but also supporting interesting and innovative implementation is very key to how we approach the gender equality work. Certainly for the Gates Foundation, scale is an imperative, because we'd like to identify solutions that work for as many as we can identify. And so that remains our imperative, and sort of really making recommendations to public investments, to sort of being able to ensure that less harm is done, but also that you're able to make solid evidence-informed recommendations is very key. And this just brings me to my last point, and about defining women's economic empowerment. And I think I would say that there's been an over-pivoting of defining women's women's empowerment overall in very, very narrow individual terms. So when we think of agency, when we think of decision-making, we're only thinking about women. We're thinking about an individual woman being able to negotiate within certain spaces. Not that that's unimportant, but it's insufficient. So I do think that thinking through, especially with our work with women's collectives, trying to understand, how do you build collective action, collective agency, what's that, how do we measure it well, is definitely, I think, one of the big challenges we've identified, and certainly an area that we'd like to contribute to. And a second piece, or a related piece to that, is again, empowerment. You look at, conventional measures of them. Conventional measures of empowerment tends to be very, very household focused and very, very private domain focused. And while that's again not unimportant, we know that the institutional context for women's empowerment, and especially women's economic empowerment, but I would say any other kind of whatever political, social empowerment, that women have to negotiate multiple institutions. And so markets, state other kinds of banks, I mean anything, what have you. They're all institutions that are within the ecosystem, and so for us it's not just that she's empowered in her private domain and will magically somehow be able to go and articulate her needs and then be able to access things. It's all very bound up within those negotiations, and how do you really think of economic empowerment in a broader institutional frame. I know I said that was the last point, but I have one more last point, which is, I think again going back to this, way that we've been generating evidence on empowerment has become so. I feel that, it tends to become so individually focused that you lose the sense that there's structural constraints. There's an economy, there's a political context, there's other things, social context, there's informal and formal institutions and norms. And so if we only try to empower women within, that you go from one sector to another sector, you increase your income from 50 rupees to 100 rupees, without any attention to what's that sector, what do those, what are the policy contexts that really define availability of work, quality of work, and so on, then we end up, we don't know what we're doing. Are we just shifting some things? Are we substituting? What are the effects that we're actually looking at? So I do think that for us, and that's why I said defining economic empowerment is something that we'd like to do really carefully, where we're able to pay attention to both structure as well as agency, and not romanticize agency and empowerment as this very individually driven sort of outcome. With that, I hand it over to Thomas.
I'm going to follow a little bit in terms of what Yamini said about the importance of scale. But before I do so, I just want to introduce also the specific work we're currently conducting. I'm here on behalf of the Evidence Consortium on Women's Groups. It's also a Gates Foundation supported initiative. It's a partnership with the Population Council, with Stanford University, and the Evans School of Policy Analysis and Management of the University of Washington. Soon to be joined by a number of other institutions in Uganda and Nigeria, which we still have to finalize. The basic goal that we're trying to achieve here is really aiming to generate, synthesize, and disseminate evidence on women's groups. And this specifically focuses on women's groups in India, Uganda, and Nigeria. So as I mentioned already, today, I think many of the panelists have already hinted at the importance of measuring women's economic empowerment, have given a number of definitions of women's economic empowerment. I just want to give one example, basically, based on the Jivika program in Bihar, which is part of the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, which has been introduced by Bidisha before. It's a program that currently targets approximately 6 million households in the state of Bihar, which is only one of the many states where the National Rural Livelihoods Mission is implemented. The program currently is aiming to reach approximately 70 million households. So we're not just talking about scale here, we're really talking about a very large scale. And I think that raises a number of different challenges that actually make the mechanisms through which women's collectives and women's groups can achieve their goals slightly different than if we're looking at pilot programs. If we look at the effects of women's groups on women's empowerment, there are many measurement challenges, but overall there's quite some promising evidence actually that shows that women's groups, and particularly economic self-help group programs, do show significant promise when it comes to improving women's empowerment. That said, a number of recent initiatives, including the Jivika program and impact evaluation of that program, show actually that when these programs move to scale, there's a little bit of a trade-off between reach and depth of these programs, where possibly in the process where programs move to scale, where programs move from approximately 10,000 women to 5 million women in about 8 years. That's a massive leap. And as a result, and preliminary evidence at least suggests that in that process, there are still positive effects on asset ownership, particularly for landless households, possibly less so on women's empowerment, and overall the effects, so slightly smaller direct effects on these like traditional outcomes. What I just want to mention here in terms of measurement, I think there are two big challenges here in terms of measurements that are critical when it comes to moving programs to scale. I think the first one is really examining like what actually happens when these programs move to scale. We don't really know that at this point. Like what is the quality of implementation that remains after these programs move to scale? What components are well implemented? Also, what components are able to achieve scale? What components are not able to achieve scale? And I think the second one, and this is why I'm bringing up the graph here, is really like when we're looking at the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, and in this case, the Jivika program in Bihar, the cost per program participant for approximately 55,000 program participants is a lot different than if we're moving to scale with approximately 6 million program participants. If you look at the evidence, and this is primarily because there are so many fixed costs associated with this program, the cost of the Jivika program, this is only one component of the costs, basically moved down from approximately $60 per program participant for approximately 10,000 women program participants, to approximately $6 per program participant when we moved. So the cost per program participant decreased by a factor of 10 when we move these programs to scale. So there's a real trade-off here in terms of like possibly these program effects become a little bit smaller on average. At the same time, it may not hurt the cost effectiveness of these programs. There's a real trade-off. In addition, when you move programs to scale, there are a number of alternative pathways that come to play. Particularly when you reach entire communities and entire districts, there are also market forces that start to play a role. What we see here basically, and this is for the Jivika program in Bihar, probably the strongest evidence. In Jharkhand as well, probably a little bit less so, or at least less rigorous evidence, but we see that prices and wages start to change as a result of the introduction of these programs. In particular, when these programs start to get bigger, what we actually see is that interest rates of informal money lenders go down as a result of increased access to formal credit. So demand for informal credit actually reduces as a result of the introduction of these self-help groups. There's some promising evidence on that. Much more research needs to be done in that area as well. But like the pathways change a little bit, and there are alternative pathways that start to play a role. One thing that I've really not touched upon yet, and maybe the final point that I just want to make, is really the fact that in these cost effectiveness analysis that I show, and we see that there's like a $1.15 benefit for every dollar invested when we look at preliminary evidence from the Jivika program in Bihar, when we combine impact evaluation data with cost data from the World Bank. What we really see, like, this does not take into consideration women's empowerment. There are lots of challenges when it comes to measuring women's empowerment. Those challenges are multiplied when we look at incorporating women's empowerment in return on investment analysis. We can look at like to what extent women's empowerment can actually result in improvements in nutrition outcomes. We can look at to what extent it improves women's labor market participation. But we're still having like a challenge there, because ultimately what I'm doing here now is basically really look at the benefits of the indirect benefits of women's economic empowerment. What I'm not doing yet is really taking into consideration the instrumental value of women gender equality by itself in these cost benefit analysis and return on investment analysis, which is really critical as well. Not going to present a solution here, but certainly something to consider when we want to incorporate women's economic empowerment and other types of empowerment in return on investment analysis.
So I think that the panelists have given us a broad brush of a landscape that points out that taking on women's economic empowerment is actually contested in many important ways in terms of how to define it, how to approach it, what your assumptions are going to be, the type of programming, and that's all before you get to the questions about evaluating, and that's before we get to synthesizing evidence. So what is it that we need to be asking ourselves and calling ourselves to account to say, actually, this is more than just a passing problem, or maybe the problem for the next study or the next donor. And what do we need to actually stand up and say, this isn't going to work until we take it on and tackle it effectively? So I'll use just one example. There are many, and I hope that my colleagues will pick up on this, about what are those priority gaps and problems. What do we need to do more of? What do we need to do less of or stop doing immediately? So to kick off, everyone mentioned one way or another the importance of understanding gendered social norms as a given. And yet, the reality is that oftentimes, too often, it is not a requirement. It is something that's known and then almost willfully ignored. Why? Well, it can be donors saying that, in fact, I only want to give you $100,000 and you need to finish whatever you're going to do, your pilot and your rapid evaluation in 9 months. And to look at norms takes longer, takes more tools, takes more money, takes a different combination of expertise. So sometimes it's the donors. Sometimes it's the research community that's just used to working in a certain way. Economists like looking at financial stuff. They are less comfortable looking at the arguments that go on about who controls the money and how it's going to be spent and the roles that are behind that. Ooh, that's a bit messy. Hard to quantify. And the power dynamic says that the economists don't have to take it on. So these are things that came out in various nice ways in people's presentations, but I want to actually shine a harsher light on some of them to try to open up the space for the panelists to now come back and say, really, what is it that I think if I could have a magic wand, this is what I would insist for the way I do research, or what my donor needs to do for me, or what we need to be focused on. So with that, I want to turn it over. And please, any burning question that anybody has for any of your colleagues, feel free to trump what I just said and ask that question. So who's gonna be brave and go first?
Yamini always pushes me first. So I think that's very well summarized. I think there are two issues here. One is, are we doing enough to measure these contexts and these social constraints that that we face in trying to change or influence in any way women's economic empowerment? And the other thing is, how do we, if we are measuring them and if we are able to do that, then are we shifting these norms in any way? I think that was something that was also discussed on the panel. And I think, I can sort of give an example from one of the studies that we are doing under the IWH initiative, which is, we're doing a study which is in the industrial areas around Delhi, in trying to understand first what are the perceptions and expectations that both women and men have towards working in factories, towards working in the manufacturing sector, particularly of women. So what are the expectations that husbands have about the kinds of work that they would want their wives to do? So we are working in the context of, what is the norm? What is the, where are the stigmas attached to specific kinds of work? And understand this both from the perspective of the men in the community as well as the perspective of the women. And what we often tend to forget is what I referred to when I was just ending my, that 5 minute, which was very often women tend to internalize these expectations. And very often they would echo what you would hear also from the men in the community, or they might be even more stringent in terms of these norms that they express, as opposed to the men, what the men express in the community. So is there enough of a dialogue also between the two genders Or is it that, you have taken for granted that, yes, my husband or the men in the community have these expectations from me, and I have to work within these constraints, or whatever I do, and that's a given, right? So sometimes there is this lack of, there's this misinformation that exists which can lead to suboptimal outcomes. That's number one. So what we are trying to do here is to measure it both from the perspective of the men and the women. And I think that was something very interesting that Bidisha mentioned also, which is not just, not just dynamics within the household, but also the community and the network. And when you take it outside, what you realize is that very often individuals form these norms or expectations around what they think the community expects them to think, right? Or what the right behavior might be. And sometimes they're wrong as well. So for instance, there was a very nice recent study which was looking at Saudi Arabia, and when they tried to understand what they asked the men to sort of express what they thought the expectations of the community were in terms of whether the wife should work or women should work or not. The men tended to overestimate the norm against women working, whereas when they were informed that no, your neighbors or your community does not have these stringent expectations, that they're not against women working, then they kind of opened up and allowed their women to go out and work. So what I'm trying to say over here is also, there's that qualitative aspect to doing research, which we're obviously not able to measure. But I think it's very important for us to understand what is the context in which we are working before we think of shifting those attitudes or introducing interventions or evaluating interventions. So which interventions worked, which didn't work, it's very important to understand that context and to be able to measure it. And that's a challenge, but I think we should take that challenge head on.
So can I build on that for the next speakers, which is in the JPAL guidance on empowerment, there's the point being made that context is all important and looking at gender norms is very important. And the suggestion in that guidance is that, this should be done during the formative phase. And I'm reminded here of this is great research that's going on, but it seems to not necessarily be joined up with attitudes and dialogue being part of programming. So another point of what we've learned from GROW and other major programs is that empowerment programs at work are multi-component. So my challenge is, how would you take these recommendations that Farzana has given, but build that into a response that's a programmatic and an evaluation response? How does evaluation have to respond to that if these are so important? What's the work that needs to be done in that way? Bidisha's put it, yes, Gillian and then Bidisha.
So I'll say something just quickly, maybe more perspective of how donors can facilitate that happening. And I think that what we're trying to do, and I think a shift that is happening more commonly, is really long-term programming. Like, we're looking at a strategic plan that's 10 years and not 5 years anymore, because 5 years makes us change our course way too quickly, we lose momentum. So we're looking at 10 years, so we can start making investments that allow people to go back over time and check again, because I think you'll always be disappointed if you're looking for norm change in a 2-year program. It's just not, you won't be able to measure that. You'll see higher income maybe, or a couple more years of schooling, but beyond that, you're probably not going to capture what you're looking for. So I think there's a really important piece where we can facilitate that by allowing research programs to make long-term investments, which is, I think, what's needed. And I also think that I think it's hard to measure norms. I do think it's doable. There's some guidance out there on it from other sources outside of JPAL. JPAL, that's a good guide, but I do think that it's something that needs to be built into a program as the goal of the program, from the beginning right through to the end, through the analysis, through the way that you do outreach, through everything. And that comes through as well in a proposal. There's a difference between a proposal that oversamples women versus one that really takes a gender analysis from beginning to end and has an empowerment framework and everything. And that's very clear. And that comes from having the right team. And I also think that comes from having the right partner on the ground. If it's an impact evaluation, you're implementing something, having a partner that is not sort of dropped in, but is really embedded in that space, is either trying to implement the program themselves, have identified that research question themselves, have connected to people on the ground who identify the problem. But yeah, giving primacy to those voices that aren't developed in a university but are actually developed on the ground will give you a better sense of what change needs to happen, so that you're measuring the right norms and you have a deeper understanding of what it is you're trying to do.
Great. Bidisha, then Yamini?
I think it's one of the first steps that needs to be taken up if you really want to take gender seriously in evaluation as well as in implementation is to build a gender theory of change. This we find is usually is quite lacking. Whether we are looking at the theory of change of a program or the theory of change of an evaluation, and that can lead to serious shortcomings in the program side as well as on the evaluation side, because you don't know where women stand in the entire program. There could be a program that is entirely meant for women and yet is gender blind. The other point I would like to stress about is that, let's not think about gender of women's empowerment program as being something very top down. Participation of women and where is it that women themselves feel they can push the boundaries for their maximum benefit? Those are needed, it's needed to be known. And, and this has to again go beyond the household, it has to go to the community and into the market where women are likely to be interacting more, if that's the vision that we have. My third call would be for mixed methods, because mixed methods and multiple methods of triangulation, of understanding empowerment. And really, I think the field has grown in this, but not so, but it has really remained in the academic circle. It hasn't really come down to being to the more policy oriented and something that can be used to generate important indicators, things like reveal preference games. They're difficult to understand, but let's try to get them more often, let's try to simplify them, let's try to use them. Use quantitative and qualitative methods. Farzana has already spoken about it. As, you say a yes-no kind of answer may not give you as much of depth as sustained engagement with the participants of a program will. So yes, embedding someone into the program is very important. I don't think we have the luxury, at least in gender, to just go in as evaluator at the baseline, come out at the end line. Or just go back at the end line. We have to be there throughout, understanding the processes.
Thank you. Yamini?
I just want to add a couple of points to this. It's a really interesting question, and again, dovetailing from Gillian more as a funder. I think one of the biggest challenges we face is that certain disciplines have come to colonize this field and the way that we measure empowerment and the way we do evaluation. So and therefore what happens is our theory is very limited. And in fact, I would say many evaluations end up being very atheoretical. Like theory doesn't just come from, statistical analysis alone. And especially when you're talking about gender, you're looking at feminists. I mean, I am yet to receive a proposal that actually talks about feminists. Actually, I received 2 out of like 100. But I think where there has been a lot of work done in trying to understand empowerment across disciplines, there have been many, many initiatives for the last 20, 30 years. And I think it behooves younger researchers, more recent researchers, those who are active now, to really go back and look at some of it. I mean, there's the Pathways to Empowerment project, there's so many projects, and all of these materials are online. And I think they've done such deep work in multiple geographies in trying to understand this, that if we don't, so sort of coming at this, ahistorically and atheoretically is something that feels very irresponsible, and that I would say having theory and deep theory is not something to be embarrassed about. It's a strength. And the second point I'd like to make is that whether we talk about gender norms or empowerment, I mean, these have all become terms that are so reified and overused, but they completely leave out any analysis of power. And so if we want to understand some of these fundamental things, it's not, everything cannot be reduced to a behavioral experiment. I mean, there's definitely a role for it. You want to understand people's incentives, you want to understand how do you shift sort of observable behavior. But fundamentally, you're again going back to my point about institutions, that lives are governed by institutions, and those are this very, very large, powerful social institutions, norms that create and organize society, organize gender relations. So unless we really engage with this question of power and how do we see it and what's going on within each of these spaces, we will end up being very short term in our approach. So I would say that to me these are two very critical things that we tend to sort of leave out. And disciplinary diversity is welcome. So Bidisha talked about methodological diversity, and I think even there, while there's a lot talked about mixed methods, I think qualitative is just a thing you do. I mean, it's FGDs, you do 20 FGDs, and I feel you're done with it. So I would say that yes, definitely 3IE. I mean, think of this as a call to action. Like, is there a way that you can drive this agenda of how do you make it? And Thomas, your systematic review did this so well, where you took into account qualitative literature on empowerment and really brought together that systematic review that all of us still use. But I think there's a way in which the field can really galvanize around this. But I just think that theoretical and disciplinary diversity is where we're missing, and so it's always some disciplines, and you miss out the richness and the empirical sort of understanding that other social sciences can bring to this to our understanding, and not to and I think the implementation and that's a third which Bidisha has already talked about, so I won't talk about it, but deep understanding and working with implementers as also knowledge producers is something that again gets lost.
So Thomas, before I turn it over to you, just a quick yes or no, IDRC and GATE. In terms of implementing these great pointers and recommendations, for example, in a call for proposals, do you look at the research team makeup, and do you specify now areas of specialty and type of expertise, and do you ask for information about how the team will actually work? Bidisha's mentioned being embedded, and we know this stuff. That's right. It hasn't just come up in the last 10 years. How do we bring 30 years of feminist theory, gender theory, and the rest into it? So just a quick question as funders, just as a marker, and then we'll move on to Thomas, but are these yet requirements?
Yes.
Okay.
No, we ask for multidisciplinarity. We put it back to them too, to say, not like we need this number of disciplines, but tell us what you're going to do and tell us how each member of the team contributes to that. What's their background? What gives them the skills to do it?
Then do you monitor it?
And then we monitor it.
You do?
Yes.
With accountability?
Yeah. Well, that's a harder one.
As someone who's been the token gender expert on a team, I know that I'm the last one, and it takes 3 or 4 beers on the part of all the guys, oh yeah, girl, what do you think about that? Oh,
yes.
Really?
Gender, let's ask her.
Okay.
Yes. So I think,
yes, no.
Yes, absolutely, but I think you hit the nail on the head. These are very, very hard to hold organizations and teams accountable for, but you try as much as you can, but it's definitely a real challenge that we face, and I think the point about embedded evaluations, I see my colleague Sunita is here, and she's going to be on your next panel, but I do think that we have very, very large evaluations, complex evaluations looking at health systems, and one of the key principles for us is that breaking those barriers between evaluators, measurement overall, but internal, external measurement and implementation, and you try. It may or may, sometimes it works, the magic is there, and sometimes that magic has to be nudged and pushed along, but I think the principle of that is something for the last several years we've certainly been trying to do with some of our work, and very influenced by, IDRC's outcome mapping. I mean, there's a lot of work that has gone before, and so I do think that that it's something that we hope we can assume rather than, have to sort of negotiate.
Great, thank you.
Also, it comes through in the quality of the products in the end. And so we'll see it somehow, I think, usually.
Okay, that's good. Great, Thomas.
Sure. Let me just come up with two different points. Although I would say yes, they certainly do. They ask for multidisciplinarity. I can say from my own experience working with the Gates Foundation. Maybe come back to is formative research enough? I think certainly not, particularly considering the fact that social norms take such a long time to actually form. And maybe based on that, if we're actually thinking about social norms as, I want to basically bring up 2 points when it comes to social norms, because the way we have been talking about it so much, it still seems as if we're treating social norms as this homogeneous concept that is uniform across many different groups in one context. I think when we really want to take social norms seriously, we probably want to look social norms are basically about beliefs, about what other people believe. Who are those other people? For people in different groups, those other people are different. For people in a village in India, it may be the village leaders. It may be for people of different castes in India, it may be people from the dominant caste in the village. So if we really want to look at the dynamic processes of these norms, we want to continuously ask the question, what are the social networks of people? Who are they influenced by? And it's not only about individual attitudinal change that changes over time and women's empowerment that changes over time, but also whether reference categories change. Maybe people now have different people whom they want to look to when it comes to social norms. So I think this is really critical, particularly when we look at longitudinal research, that we basically continuously do that formative research and update social networks once in a while to see whom are people looking to when they want to change their behavior. And it's critical to really assess what do people believe, other people believe. But I think who are these other people is probably a very critical question here.
Thanks, Thomas. I think along those lines, I find it interesting to just say social norms. To me is too generalized.
Yes.
I mean, it's gendered social norms. They're always about inequities, and it is always about power dynamics. Now, there is an interesting point that was brought up, that it's really important to do good work to understand the degree of inequality and isolation of any given group of women, if they're the targets for the economic empowerment, which will determine what is going to be possible very specifically. So then the challenge becomes a final challenge, and then it's my job to see if we can take 3 questions from the audience, is if a powerhouse like Gates is that, has the power to move the dial, because of resource allocation and priorities, is wedded to scale, then it does seem to me to be a moment for pausing and saying, actually, have we got it right in terms of knowing how to contextualize and understand locally, and then how that relates to scaling. Thomas, you have excellent points about what does make sense to scale, but I wouldn't then want to generalize, that, okay, we're on to something there. So before I wrap up, I think we could all sit here for another hour and talk and build on all of the issues that are multiplying, that show all that we do need to be thinking about, from theory to program design to implementation to evaluating differently. Regardless of the type of evaluation that we do, it's not just a call to impact evaluation. All of us need to be rethinking things in this area, and then we'll get better synthesis if we do the primary work better. So on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for all these wonderful thoughts, and it's clear that everyone here works very hard and is very committed and passionate about working to improve how we do the programming and how we get from what we want to see, to the actions that actually do improve the lives of women, men, girls, and boys, because at the end of the day, it is joined up.